It's been a week since former Green Bay area school superintendent Dr. Claude Tiller Jr. resigned. And today is a petition going around among his supporters to have the school board reinstate him. Many just gathered for their very first meeting to address this issue. Jamal James was there. He's live in the newsroom with the First Alert update. Jamal.
Jason, many of the people at this meeting are upset that the superintendent's resignation came prior to the release of the video showing him on a hot mic during a radio interview in Atlanta, expressing how he feels about the Green Bay area school district. Some telling us today they believe Tiller, who holds a doctorate's degree in education, was pressured to resign to maintain his reputation for future employment. Students, faculty, and people from the community of all different backgrounds came out in support of reinstating Tiller. This includes members of the school board who was in attendance to listen to concerns. People lined up to speak about Tiller's comments, their experiences with the district, and also what it meant to have a black superintendent.
This is our first black superintendent, and being a son of immigrant parents here, I always looked up to the teachers and educators that I had that looked like me, but that was never the case. We are a growing diverse community in Green Bay, so I think it's super important that we keep adding more individuals and leadership that represent the community.
As of right now, the petition to reinstate Tiller on change.org has more than 600 signatures, and on Monday, there's also a school board meeting to discuss the superintendent's position. Jason, back to you.